My name's Dave Powles, and technically I got started in woodworking years and years ago when I was in high school, and I kind of carried some of the work, I'll call it shop work, forward from high school to college, and I was trained as a shop teacher, and then I left that profession because I'm sure there would have been a homicide if I had stayed on either mine or one of them kids, and so I went with a company that had a fleet. I was a fleet manager, and my son-in-law came to me in about the year 2000 and asked me would I help him make an entertainment center for my daughter for their new house, and I said yes, but neither one of us had any tooling to do that. I had everything you needed to make a barn. I had a sawzall and drills and steel saws. So we started into this project, and to make a long story short, we went to Woodcraft, and as on the way out I patted the unisaw, and I told Donnie, my son-in-law, that there's the centerpiece of the shop. Well, unbeknown to me, he went back to Woodcraft and bought that saw. So I said that this guy is interested in this, so I have been acquiring tools and shop equipment ever since. A lot of what I look at from a bandsaw perspective is from a furniture maker's perspective as opposed to a turner's perspective. So I'm going to try to shift gears into a turner's perspective because, quite frankly, I don't cut up very many big logs and stumps and some of the kind of stuff that you guys do or gals do when you go out and cut this stuff out of the woods. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I'm just saying that it's two different avenues of focus. One is I use mine for the furniture aspects of things, a lot of curve cutting, a lot of what we call resawing. If you're not familiar with resawing, I'll talk a little bit about resawing and whatnot. So that's the focus that I usually have. So I'm going to try to shift gears and explain as we go along what I think you need as far as some of the aspects of what you folks do with your bandsaws. So to start off with bandsaws, how many folks in here have a bandsaw of some? Okay, nearly everybody has a bandsaw. All right, next. The bandsaw is usually sized by the size of the wheel. Some people will tell you that it's sized by the distance of the clearance in the throat, which should be very, very similar to the size of the wheel. This has got, go against the riser block back here, you'll see we're right at 13 inches. Well, this is a 14-inch bandsaw if you measure the diameter of the wheel. It should measure 14 inches outside of the tire to outside of the tire. Now, bandsaws come in all different sizes and varieties and whatnot. I've got two 14-inch bandsaws in my shop, and I've got a 36-inch bandsaw. So to give you some idea how big a 36-inch bandsaw is, it's 10 feet tall, it weighs 3,000 pounds, and the wheels are from my fingers across like that. In other words, if I put this ruler up to those wheels, that's how wide it would be. Now, you say, what are the advantages of that? Well, obviously you can saw a bigger piece. It's 24 inches underneath from the top of the table to underneath the guides when the guides are fully raised. So that means I could cut a log that big or resaw a board that big up there to where my hands are. This is a 12-inch resaw capability. In other words, if I raise this guide post up here like this, we're going to have approximately 12 inches underneath the guides. You've got about 11 and a half or so, close enough for government work. It might not be quite 24 either. The advantage of the big wheels is number one, momentum. They're huge. It would take about 3 of us to pick one of them up. And once you get those babies turning, you get very little vibration and you get really, really smooth sawing. Second of all, they're large. If I take a nail or piece of wire and stand here and flex it across like this, the smaller the surface that I flex it across is going to cause it to heat and break a lot quicker. So with a larger diameter, a bigger outside circumference, that blade is going to flex a lot less, and it's going to mean that I can run that saw considerably faster blade speed than what you would a smaller saw. This saw will run about 3,300 feet per minute. In other words, if I put a mark on here and checked how many feet I've got on the blade here, which we could do mathematically, and I could measure this mark, it would come past here 3,300 times in 1 minute. That big saw runs about 9,000 feet per minute. So there's quite a bit of difference in, in what's going on. The motor now only turns, I think it's 850 RPM. But do the math. Take 850 RPM times the circumference of the wheel, and you'll find out right quick that it's between it's up there anyway. This motor probably turns 1725 or something like that on here, and it's got a pulley. Mine is direct drive. The big saw is direct drive. So what we want to look at when we get into sawing, probably some of the most important aspects of sawing is not the machine itself, but it's the blade. How can you pick a blade that is suitable for what you're doing? And most of you know that this saw is capable of cutting curves, it's capable of cutting straight. It's a relatively safe saw when you compare it to a table saw over here, because generally speaking it doesn't have kickback associated with it. It doesn't have some of the nasty little things that can happen on those saws over there. The two things that usually happen with a bandsaw where somebody gets hurt is, number one, the blade will feed out the right side of the saw. Now if I turn my back to you, this would be the right side of the saw. If the blade breaks, it's coming out this way. So in other words, if you're watching somebody saw, don't stand over here where I'm sawing. They're pretty safe back over there, but that blade, the way it's turning, what it does, it breaks here, it spits out here, and it just rolls right on out on this side over here sometimes. Not always, but sometimes. And the other thing that happens in a lot of cases, somebody will be pushing a big board through in a resaw mode, and I'll mention that here in just a minute. They'll be coming through here like this, and I'm not going to get in front of you, but I would be over there pushing this through. Now what happens in a lot of cases, they get almost all the way through, they've got their fingers back here on the back side, they are pushing against the back, and it splits out. In other words, the cut runs out the back of the saw, so the wood goes like this, and it takes their fingers with it. So what they need to do is get a push block when they get up here about 6 or 8 inches out there, and this is not a good push block, but a homemade push block of some kind where you've got a hook on it, you can get off here to the side and you can push it through. But this is better than nothing because your hand is away from the blade and you can push it on through here like this without any danger of getting your fingers in the blade.
Dave.
Yes.
Dave, a bandsaw will suck it out like that when you get near the end? I've never experienced that.
Okay. I didn't, if I said suck it out, I didn't really mean that it'll self-feed, okay? Okay, what happens is, particularly if you're sawing a board, it's not so bad if you're sawing a board like this, at this height, but you get a board up here at maximum capacity, you're in here 8 or 10 inches wide, you're pushing pretty hard, especially if you're using a blade here that looks like it's probably got 6 teeth to the inch. In other words, we're going to talk about how many teeth you would need in a cut. Now this blade's a real good blade for certain things, but we're going to try to find out what those certain things are. As far as, I'll try to be a good actor for you and stay in the screen there. That's a tough job, folks, especially when we get to woodworkers, because then we can be moving all over the place. But let's see what we've got here in, let me get a measurement here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, there's no such thing as a 5-toother. It's probably a 6-toother. I'm probably. But if we're going to resaw, we need something down in the 2, 3 range. In other words, you would like a maximum of 7 teeth. Now you can't always do this because when you get up way up here, you'd like a maximum of 7 teeth to be engaged, or a minimum of about 3 teeth to be engaged anytime you're cutting. In other words, if you're cutting, you'd like at least 3 teeth in the work, and then, in other words, 1 in the middle, 1 going out, 1 coming in. If you get much coarser than that, it's going to vibrate, you're going to get a harmonic, you're going to get a chatter in there. If you get real fine blades, you get up into the 10s and the 12s, numbers like this, you can get some blades that have relatively small teeth on them. They're excellent for cutting thin work. They're excellent for cutting fine detail work that you want to end up smooth. You're not going to end up, when you're running a blade that's 2 to 3 teeth, sometimes you get even into the bigger saws, like that big saw, you can get down into the more than, let me see if I can say this right, Roland, help me out, you know what I'm trying to say, less than 1 tooth per inch.
That's no such thing as a
half a tooth per inch. But there is, I mean, how do you get a half a tooth? It sounds stupid, but it's true, you know. And you get down into these wide-spaced tooth patterns, excuse me, for resawing and for doing, I mean, big bridge timbers and stuff like that. So if you're cutting pretty good sized stuff, get a coarse blade, and it'll do a lot less heating. It'll do a lot less, it'll require a lot less force to feed it, and it'll be safer in the long run. Anytime you can use a saw with less force, and learn your saw to where you know when the blade's dull. Most people will run a bandsaw until the blade breaks, and by then the blade is way past dull. So learn how, when you cut, and a good way to do it is to get a board like this and cut on it a little bit, and you'll find that you won't have to have much feed pressure if you've got a good blade, it's got a good tooth pattern, and it's got the correct number of teeth, or close to the correct number of teeth for what you're doing. You'll just be able to lay that down there, and you'll just be able to cut effortlessly. But you'll find, as the blade dulls, you'll be having to push harder and harder, and it'll get, yet the blade, you'll come back here and the blade will feel sharp. When you touch the blade to your fingertips, it'll feel sharp. As you get into thinner wood, this blade probably wouldn't be a bad, this will give us 3 teeth. This will give us, this blade right here will give us 3 teeth in here. 1 coming in, 1 going out, and 1 in the middle. So that's kind of the difference in the numbers of teeth. Now, there's some patterns that the way the teeth are made that we might want to take a look at. And basically, it's called, you can get into some others when you get into metal cutting, but I don't think any of you are going to get into metal cutting because most of these bandsaws are running way too fast for metal cutting. You need to be down in the 900, 600 feet per minute for metal. And wavy set and all that. But as far as wood's concerned, you got a regular set, just an ordinary tooth shape, say a regular tooth. You've got what they call a skip tooth, where they take out 1 tooth in between the other teeth and just sort of skip a tooth. You've got a hook tooth. Now, if you want to cut big stuff, you don't care what the final cut looks like, use a hook tooth blade. It'll be real aggressive, it'll be safe. The only disadvantage of some of the hook tooth blades is if you get something round in there, it can make it roll. In other words, the blade will actually hook into your work and cause it to take it away from you. So be very careful if you're sawing, if you've turned something on the lathe that's round, you're up against a slick surface here on the table, and it's going to take that and grab that and pull it around. So watch for that from a safety standpoint. So a hook tooth is probably an excellent tooth to use if you're going to be doing the kind of cutting that I think most of you folks in here are going to be doing. final tooth, sometimes you get into what's called a raker tooth. That will be more directly related to how the tooth is set. Now, in order for a standard blade, not a carbide blade, but a standard blade, to have enough clearance to clear the back of the blade so it won't heat, those teeth are bent to each side like this. Well, if I take a piece of steel that's 25 thousandths thick and I bend it 10 thousandths this way and 10 thousandths this way, that means I have 45 thousandths clearance. I have a kerf that's 45 thousandths of an inch wide. Unless I screw up when I go to set my guides and I knock all the set out when I set my guides up, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But normally we should have some set so I've got some clearance. Well, what we're talking about when we get a raker tooth is where we have set on one tooth, a tooth that's standing up straight in the middle to clean out sawdust. That's the primary function of a raker, is to bring that around and clean out the sawdust. And then we have another alternate set the other way, if you can follow my fingers. They will do the cutting. The raker is in between to remove the sawdust from the kerf. So it kind of clears that out. I know some of you have gotten into this where you've got a big object in there. You've probably had a fairly fine blade on there, and it seems like it's packing up sawdust in the kerf. I mean, sawdust just seems like it's cramming in there, and it's even worse when it's green. And you people fool with green wood. So, see, I don't hardly ever cut green wood to go in furniture. So that's going to make it even worse from that standpoint. In other words, if you use a coarser tooth pattern, you use a hook tooth pattern, and you can overcome some of the problems that occur when you start cutting the green wood. The other thing that I should have mentioned when I was talking about blades as well is the thickness of a blade. Don't try to run a real thick blade on a small saw. Again, we get into the flexing situation. What is a real thick blade? 25 thousandths is plenty thick for this saw right here. If you can get this blade made up in 25 thousandths or less thickness, that's where you need to go. Stay away from 32s, stay away from 35s. People tell you, oh, it's a heavy-duty blade. Yeah, it's a heavy-duty blade on the right saw. But you start putting a 35 thousandths blade on this saw, you're going to get real short life. So if you can stick with a 25 or even somewhat thinner than that, a 20, there are some, especially for the three-wheel saws, they had some that were down in the 10s, 12s, and 14s. But you don't find them just every day. I think when you walk into woodcraft, in this size blade, which this blade would be, by the way, a 105 inches. 14-inch saw with a riser block is 105 inches. A 14-inch saw without this riser block, this 6-inch riser block back here, is 93 and a half. So when you see those saws hanging on the rack up there at Woodcraft, and they're about the only place around unless you go to Ferris or you go to Charlotte Saw and Knife or some of the other specialty houses, they can make you a blade while you wait if you need something that you can't find somewhere else. So that to me is the most important part of the whole project. In other words, getting the correct blade for the work that you're intending to do. Now, the width of the blade, okay? The width of the blade is going to determine the radius that we can cut. If we have a, and this is kind of easy to remember, if we have a 1/4-inch blade on here, now remember, a 1/4-inch blade encompasses the teeth as well. In other words, the width of the tooth and the back into the back of the blade. This blade here is, this is a 1/2-inch blade right here. Okay, a 1/4-inch blade should be able to, with somebody operating it fairly proficiently, should be able to saw a 1/4 size circle out of a piece of wood. In other words, if I draw around this 1/4 that I'm holding in my hand, 25-cent piece here, you should be able to take a 1/4-inch blade and saw that circle out without too much binding and that kind of thing. Generally, you find your blades will run somewhere from about an 1/8 inch wide for a saw like this up to 3/4 of an inch wide. And on these saws, if you're doing furniture work again, you probably cannot tension a 3/4 inch blade where you can resaw wood like you should. A 1/2 inch blade is probably as big a, as wide a blade as you can tension properly with the 14 inch bandsaw similar to this. They will tell you a 3/4 inch blade, but I wouldn't go there. Now tension is another element of blade installation, and we'll talk a little bit about tension, because there are some folks that will tell you that they use low tension blades, that they use silicone steel blades, that they do this, they do that, with all this voodoo, hoodoo stuff, and I've not been able to figure out much difference in the blades. But there are some folks that will tell you that you put this blade in here, you back the guides off, you start the saw up, you detension it until it starts to flutter, and then you tighten the tension up till it stops fluttering, and you've got the tension regardless of what the gauge on the back says back here. Well, if it floats your boat, I guess it's okay. I'm not going to argue with them, but I don't do that. Actually, I use a blade tension gauge, which is a dial indicator, and instead of measuring in thousandths, it measures in 10,000ths. And it's in a frame, and you clamp it on your blade, and you put tension on your blade, and it actually moves the frame. If you can, it's hard to, I should have brought it with me, and I forgot, to be honest with you. But the average individual does not need a blade tension gauge on a 14-inch bandsaw. That's overkill. The next aspect of blades and whatnot, are there any questions about blades? I don't remember what the radius of a 1/2 inch blade is. I think the radius of a 3/4 blade is like 7 inches. In other words, it will cut out a 14-inch circle. I'm not sure on a 1/2 inch blade. Well, you know what the radius is on a 1/2 inch? It's what, Ed?
6 or 8 inches.
I'm thinking it's probably about 3.5 inch radius.
3.5 on a 1/2 inch blade. It may be. These kinds of information are in most of the books that you'll get. A lot of times the box that the bandsaw blade comes in, it'll tell you what it is. But if you've got any question about it, go ahead and get a chart and put it up on your saw so you kind of know which blade is best for certain circumstances, which blade will cut what radiuses and whatnot, and go from there. I'll be right honest with you. Generally speaking, I leave a resaw blade. When I say resaw, I mean make 2 boards out of this one. This board is about 1.5 inches thick, and if I want 2 3/4 boards out of it, well, yeah, it's right on 1.5 inches. Well, I can't make 2 3/4 boards out of that because there's something called a curve up the middle, and then I'm going to have to plane it and whatnot. So maybe I could make, I don't know, 2 5/8 boards out of this by the time I was done. But if I wanted to make 2 pieces of wood out of this one piece, I could put my fence on here, and I could run it through like this, and I could resaw it in half. And now, does anybody get into resawing? Is any of you doing much Okay. Okay. Resawing is opening a can of worms, because what you would think would happen is that I could put this fence up here, and this, by the way, this Craig fence is an excellent fence. This is actually the one that I've got. You would think that I could set this. Ed's shaking his head back there. I'm going to have to move around here to see. You would think I could set this to 3/4 and kind of take out my kerf and whatnot and end up with 2 3/4 inch, wouldn't you? I mean, I see some head shaking. Folks have tried this, and they found out it just doesn't work too well, does it? Because what happens when you start sawing this? What's going to happen next? When I start sawing this, if I was to turn this saw on and push this through here now, I wouldn't want to try this. I could do it if I was really slow, didn't feed very fast, and let this blade clear itself if this blade's good and sharp, and I don't know how long it's been on there or anything and whatnot. But if I did that, I probably could resaw this. This looks like it might be mahogany, which is fairly soft and whatnot. So I could probably do that, but what is probably going to happen?
It's going to drift.
it's gonna, yeah. In other words, it's gonna wander. It's gonna get a bow in here in it. It's gonna, in other words, on the flat surface, it's gonna have something like this going on, isn't it? All right, now let's see if we can explore what causes all that. And people will tell you they can set up a bandsaw so it doesn't have blade drift and whatnot. Yeah, I'm not so sure about all that, because that's part of what's causing it. You start in over here at 3/4, and lo and behold, no matter how hard you hold it against the fence, the blade goes down here and it comes out. I'm exaggerating, but it comes out here somewhere where my thumb is, and I end up with a wedge-shaped piece of wood that's basically no good. So that may be because part of the set has gone out on one side of the blade. It may be because I've got sawdust packing up in there. I don't have a coarse enough blade to do this. Now the bow in there, when the cut becomes bowed like this, it's usually from lack of tension. In other words, the blade is not tensioned sufficiently enough to keep it from doing that as it goes through that. I don't want to get into, and I'm not sure I'm an engineer enough to explain all that to you, but I know it happens, and I know some of you know it happens because you've had it happen. I can see some heads shaking and whatnot. So there is another avenue which may help you. Another thing, of course, you want to make sure before you start resawing is that you take a square, a good true square. You can't beat a sterret, by the way, and set it down here on your table and square it up with your blade and make sure that this is in fact true. Also, you want to make sure your guides are set. We're going to talk about your guides and whatnot, and some of these saws have a little problem actually with the guide post. Let's see what happens here, especially in these resaw posts. This one's not bad. All right, here's what's happening. Here's what I was looking for and you couldn't see it. The guide blocks right now are right at the bottom of the gullets in the teeth. That's the hole between the teeth. You know, you got a tooth coming out here and a tooth coming out here, and then you got a valley in between. Right now, it's in between the gullets in the teeth. When I lower it down here, it's about 1/8 of an inch back, or maybe a little less, from the gullets of the teeth. So what's happening is this arm is not moving directly parallel to the blade. There's nothing wrong. This is a common situation with 14-inch bandsaws like this, where the guide post does not move in direct proportion. And if you want to find out everything there is to know about a 14-inch bandsaw, whether it be a Delta or a Jet or whatever, go online and look up Iyatura Design and get his catalog. Louis Iyatura has done immense amounts of research, and he offers very many distinct items to correct problems that occur with these saws. And I don't have time tonight to talk about them all, but he sells zero clearance inserts for this insert right here. And this kind of looks like it might have been a zero at one time, because it's kind of sort of whacked up here a little bit, but that's okay, that's fine. And what I mean by a zero clearance insert is an insert where you have nothing but a kerf where the blade will just barely go through, so that you don't have little pieces jamming down in here and the tendency to try to reach in there and all that kind of unsafe stuff. So I like a zero clearance insert, and I usually try to keep one in my smaller saws. My bigger saw is tough because I use a big blade on it, wide blade. And so I would recommend these zero clearance inserts. He also sells table shims. He also sells high tension springs. He sells a whole lot of stuff to, I would call it, soup up these 14-inch bandsaws to where you can get very, very good performance out of them. Now, if you're into resawing and you really want to resaw, this saw probably has a 3/4 horse motor on it. You put a 2-horse motor on it and you will be amazed at what this saw will do without changing anything. It's just got the guts to go through the wood. Before I got that 36-inch bandsaw, I used to resaw with a Delta, this is a clone of the Delta. There's only one slight difference between this and the Delta, and that's the guide blocks, the lower guide blocks down here, And if I have time, if David doesn't mind, I'll take the table off and show you exactly what I'm talking about. The only problem is the guide bars are going to inhibit that a little bit, and it's going to be a bigger, he's not even here to hear me talk about this, taking this all apart. But anyway, the guide blocks down here are at this point right here, if any of you can see my finger under here, whereas on the Delta they're on an angle and they come up almost underneath the table. So that means that you can get a really good blade support on a Delta by bringing this one down on top of your work and this one coming up right underneath your work, and whereas this one lacks just a little bit, the Jet does lacks just a little bit in that. But anyway, be that as it may. All right, he just brought the solution here to one of the difficulties that you run into with resawing. And I'm not going to set this all up, but I think you can see. First of all, to do what we're going to do with what he just showed me here is I'm going to take a marking gauge and mark a line down the middle of this board where I want it to rip, where I want it to resaw. All right, then I'm going to put this on the fence in such a manner as this, and this slides right on very easily here. So when I have this on there, and I have it clamped on here, I have this kind of set up so that it's approximately where my line wants to be, and I have a single point fence now. When it starts going off course, I can guide this wood up against this single point fence. So if you are trying to resaw without a single point fence, I would try to get a single point fence. Even if it's homemade, you can take a dowel rod and put 2 screws through your regular fence. And is that what you do? I heard this gentleman in the front, and I don't know him, he's saying that's what I do. There's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. Take a 1-inch dowel rod or something and put 2 screws in the back of it, put it through your fence. An excellent idea. You can even take, and if you have to make one from scratch, take 2 bolt board down here like this to clamp on here. Put a board at right angles here, bevel the edge of this board and bring it over there. Simple as that. You've got a resaw. You've got a resaw fence. So you don't have to have a whole bunch of fancy paraphernalia and plunder to make this stuff up. And you can make a fence like this that you can clamp on to your saw table. Take a board, a 2-inch board like this. Take one of those grip clamps, not quite this wide maybe, and cut a slot up in here, take it apart, take the non-movable end off of it, which is a roll pin. You can take the roll pin out, cut a groove in here, set that down in the groove, put a couple piece of wood or something over top of it, and let it come up against here, put a little tag on this end to catch it over here, put it up against there, just squeeze that quick grip up against this end to hold it in place. So you can make a fence if you don't have a fence, real easy. I will, this is a Craig setup that David's got, and I just happen to have one too, and I like it real well. For one thing you can do with this fence, if you can determine what the drift on your blade is, okay, you can do that by taking a board, drawing a straight line down here, putting it up against here and sawing this board, and as soon as you start to have to turn it to stay on that line, get partway down here to where this board is on an angle like that. Scribe a pencil line, and I'm exaggerating this now, but scribe a pencil line, take your carpenter's pencil out of your pocket here and scribe a line on your saw. You can't see it, but I can. And then set your fence to that line. Now you have just set in your drift into your fence. And that's doable with this fence with these 2 bolts down here. So those people are good folks out there. I highly recommend them. Good to do business with. With 2 saws, I called them up and I asked them would they sell me an extra guide rail, because I never use more than 1 saw at a time, and I switch fences back and forth. And they said sure. So she wasn't sure what the price was, but she called me back a little bit later on, and it was very nominal. So I got 2 of these with one fence without buying the whole package again. So good folks. Anyway, that may help you a little bit with the resawing and figuring out how your particular blade is drifting. Now remember, every blade you put on there is going to drift different. There's going to be a different drift pattern for every single blade you put on there. So if you think you've got this line in the right place today and you change blades, forget it, Jack. It ain't going to happen. So when you have changed blades, go ahead and run your thin board, 3/4 board is fine, through your saw and try to stay on the line. And has anybody experienced what I'm talking about? Okay, and so when you get partway through your saw, then just stop, pencil off the angle you got, and go with it. Curve sawing is usually not a problem, but what I find is, okay, you want to cut a nice cabriole curve or something out of this, guess what? What's wrong with this picture? Now remember, I'm standing over here, okay? I'm sawing. Look at this amount of blade exposed for the thickness of my wood. I see this, I'm a member of the Charlotte Woodworkers Club, and you would not believe how many times our guys will go to the bandsaw where somebody set it up like this, perfectly legitimate. They were resawing something real thick, and they will not bring it down. Just unconsciously, they're running a piece through there. Look at how much more exposure you've got from a safety standpoint. Look at how much more inaccuracy you're going to have and how much harder it's going to be to hold it in line. Bring it down to where it's just over top of your wood, where you can still see your line, but yet it's supporting your blade. Now I only have, what, an inch and a half of blade to support there? So I'm going to get a much more accurate cut by lowering that guidepost down to where I've got it close to my work. So I would always keep it close to my work. If I was going to resaw this piece here, I would not have it up there like that. I would drop it down about like that. I mean, there's nothing, this is not rocket science, but you know, you just don't want that big gap. Another thing, if the blade should break, the blade is kind of contained by this guard assembly now. So it's less apt to shoot out there inadvertently somewhere and get you. So try to operate your saw so that it's just above the work, and it's supported here just above the work. Okay, let's talk about guide blocks, guide bearings. Everybody will tell you there's all kinds of magic guide blocks and guide bearings, and they do this and they do that and they do wonders. I'm not so sure. One thing that you need to remember about bearings in these guide assemblies right here, is everybody familiar with what I'm talking about? Is Dave has here what's called cool blocks. These are semi-ceramic or ceramic, I'm not sure which, that is different from what came on this saw. I believe metal guide blocks came on this saw. Am I correct, Dave? You can, when I get a 16th inch blade on here, I'll take hard maple and make my guide blocks, and I'll cram them, so to speak, right up against the blade. A 16th wide blade now, remember. This is a very, very narrow blade. You're not going to be able to set back from the gullies. You're not going to be able to keep these from knocking the set out of the teeth. So you're gonna have to use something. So if you've got a really, really narrow blade on there, it's hard to find 16th inch blades. You can't find them. I just take two pieces of maple and put them up against it and let it cut through and support itself that way. And then when they, and I let them stick out fairly far, and when I get some kind of wear in there, I just take them out, saw the end of them off, and put them back in here. Generally, Roland, they'll cut enough clearance to where they'll be okay. Yeah, well, you have some friction. You always are going to have a little bit, because remember, what's that, Ed?
After charge the first time, no problem.
Well, that's true too. But generally what I do is I push them up easy, of course, while the saw is running. In other words, I come to the back side of my blade here, and I push them in easily against the blade, and then I just cut the blade off and I tighten them down and I leave them there, so that they kind of cut their way in and they've cleared a curve in there, which hopefully is, I mean, if I see them smoking or something, maybe I'll back them off a little bit, but I really don't have that much trouble. I tell you what helps too, is if you can just dip them in a little oil or something like that, or leave them set overnight in a little oil, and let the wood soak up a little bit of that oil in there too. That'll help. There's another product that is really good. It's called Blade and Bit Spray. It comes in a can, and you'll be surprised what it'll help you with your blades and your bits and whatnot as far as making them work better. I don't care whether it's a table saw, whether it's a bandsaw, whether it's a shaper, whether it's a router. I don't care what the power tool is. That stuff will make it a lot easier for your machine to do what it needs to do.
Dry wax works good too.
Do what's that?
Dry wax.
Wax is another good thing that you can use. The only problem, sometimes you get into wax on furniture if you want to try to do some other kind of finishing operation. You may get a wax buildup there that inhibits, say, stain or dye when you get to finishing later on. And but that is good. There's nothing wrong with a lot of these things. Another thing from a safety standpoint, if your table is rusty, if your table is, it's hard to maneuver stuff across your table, make it slick. Make it so that if a fly lands on there, he's going to bust his fanny before he gets off. So, make it slick, because that's part of the safety. If you're having to force something in here because your table is dirty, your table is rusty, don't go there. Go ahead and fix it. There's all kinds of outfits that sell ball bearings and all sorts of different guide assemblies of various flavors and descriptions. And quite frankly, these work quite well, do a fine job. And the one disadvantage that the ball bearings have is when you're sawing resinous woods. In other words, especially green wood, you're sawing a pine or some material that has a lot of pitch or tar in it. It will build up on those ball bearings, it will build up on your blade, and it will start your blade knocking. In other words, it'll go over the tires, and we'll talk about the tires in a minute, but it'll go over the tires, and you'll hear your saw going boom, 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 because you've got a buildup on your blade. And these, either this or the steel guide that comes with it, is wiping your blade clean all the time, so you don't have that pitch buildup and you don't have the vibration that occurs as this blade passes over these tires. We'll talk about the tires in a minute. These guide blocks are designed to obviously keep the blade straight, keep the blade true, and whatnot in a vertical direction like this. Now there's also a stop bearing on here, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, which keeps the blade from coming back and coming off the wheels. In other words, it stops it at the back. And also, there's a little dance that you have to do between this particular side guide and the other one over here and the back bearing. Obviously, if you let your work push it back so far that it comes out over your teeth, that isn't going to work very good either. So the setup here is somewhat critical for each blade. And this is where multiple bandsaws, in my estimation, come in pretty handy. If you've got several bandsaws, you can give a 1/4 inch blade on one, a 1/2 inch blade on another, an 1.5 inch blade on another. And so you can, I see he's lobbying for another bandsaw already. I planted the seed, I see that, yep. And it's just handy as a hip pocket to be able to cut your curves over here and go over here and do your resawing and whatnot and that kind of thing. Another thing too, if you have a table saw and you have any, the brain says, gee, this isn't going to be easy to solve. You guys have pushed stuff through your table saw as the curve goes through. How about it coming back, marrying itself back together again, and it kicking it back through your neighbor's garage door over there? Yeah. Okay, and you know that it may be problematic. You've got this big thick timber, saw it on your bandsaw. You're not going to have any problem with any of that. Much, much safer. And once you learn to use your fence, learn to get the right blade on there, it'll go just as quick, just as easy as your table saw. Maybe easier and somewhat safer. I'm not saying that the table saw is dangerous, but I'm saying that there are forces, especially when you're dealing with thicker pieces of wood. When you get into thick wood on the table saw, there is certain inherent forces just from the growth of the tree. And as you start cutting it, it may tend to move. It may tend to open up, which is a blessing. In other words, it may tend to do this, which is really nice if it does that. Oh yes. But when it starts coming back together again, and you've got to get the screwdrivers out and go down through there to keep it from lining up your blade and throwing it back in your face, that's when that's when you run into difficulty. So you set these guides. Most folks tell you to set these guides right here, whether they be the steel or the ceramic, and I think I'm right. I'm going to have to get with David a little bit on these ceramics. Are they telling you to use the dollar bill trick on these ceramics, Dave? Is that what they...
I don't know what they tell you. I just set them where they touch lightly.
Okay, and I think that's probably a good omen on the ceramics. On the steel,
You can't do that in the field.
no, you cannot do that with the steel because you'll have too much friction. Normally, somebody help me out. What is this, 4/1000 bill?
Pass it around.
Well, it's a dollar. If you'll contribute it to the treasury when it gets to the end, I'll let you do it.
Ed only knows the $100 bill, but that's the ones he makes.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. So what I can do, I can put this dollar bill in here and I can get a clearance on those steel guides. And the thing that I want to make sure is now that I'm behind the gullets and the teeth. I'm not way back here on the blade, but I'm relatively close to behind the gullets on the teeth. Then I want to bring this bearing here forward. Right there is the stop. And this is not a bearing. This is a ceramic disc which is designed not to turn. These bearings here are inherently trouble on these saws here. There's a little cheap shielded bearing on here that gums up and just gives you an absolute fit. So what happens when this bearing stops, and it's the ball bearing, is it case hardens the back edge of your blade when you're sawing. In other words, it heats it, and I say case hardens it. Roland is the metals expert, and okay, it anneals it. It does something to the steel. Okay, I'm not a chemist, I'm not a metallurgist, I don't know, but it does something to the steel when it's not turning, when it's running. Some of you have seen this backstop bearing where the blade has actually cut grooves in it, right? This is a really good answer. Did these come from Ayatura by any chance?
No.
He sells these, so I don't know if this, and this stop block, if you want to call it that, needs to be moved out just enough to where when you start pressing on the blade, it won't go back in past here. Now, Dave, you're going to have to reset these probably. I may not have them dead on the money when I get back in there, but so anyhow.
That's the best investment I made for that saw is those guide block setup.
Yes.
They give you no trouble at all.
And I think these are ceramic rather than cool blocks.
They're ceramics.
There are all kinds of various, again, you get in Ayatura's catalog, he's got a bazillion different kinds. He's got cool blocks, he's got ball bearings, he's got the ceramic like this. But I think probably the ceramic bearings is a very good choice, or ceramic guides, excuse me, are a good choice for these 14-inch bandsaws, just knowing what the inherent problems are. Now, there's a set of guides very similar to this right underneath the table, which you're not going to be able to see from where you're at. But they need to be set also. And possibly the first few times you work with this, you may want to take the table off so you can see down in here and see what's going on underneath the saw. Now, I'm not talking about when you're trying to saw, I'm talking about when you're trying to set up your guide blocks. If you're not too familiar with moving them in and out, setting the side guide blocks this way. And this is all going to depend on what kind of guide blocks that you have on your particular saw. Okay? Now, okay, when we go to changing blades in the saw, we have a tension knob up here, which essentially lowers the wheel here. There's a spring back here. The back of the saw has got two, I guess you'd call them adjustments for lack of a better word. The one is the blade tension adjustment here. This is the blade tilt adjustment. And I'll turn it around again here in a minute and we'll talk about exactly what happens, but I want you to know what I'm doing when I get it turned around that makes it do whatever it is. Now he's got this set on a 1/2 inch on his scale right here. And except for resawing, that's probably going to be acceptable. Have you changed the spring at all or done anything? Okay. There are some higher tension springs. Again, Ayatura sells them. I think they've started to appear in the aftermarket. Carter's got them. I think even Woodcraft has some laying out somewhere. Usually it's a little yellow spring in a package in 10 or 15 bucks worth. And this is probably well worth the investment if you're trying to resaw, because it will increase the tension to about the tension you need for a 1/2-inch blade on the 3/4 setting. In other words, if you take one of Atura's yellow springs, I think I've got it right, and you put it in this saw here, and you go and put a 1/2-inch blade like we've got on there, and then take it to the 3/4 setting, it will give you about, I think it's 15,000 PSI, which is not near enough for Roland and them. They're talking 30, but these saws just do not have the capability of tension to those.
But I think that's a lot.
What's that?
That's a lot.
15 is a lot?
And
Oh,
I don't know, on mine, I have them crank it until it comes to the mark.
okay,
Yeah,
well,
We don't do a lot of heavy sawing. I mean, it's all metal. I've got 2 different blades, fine and of course 1/2-inch. Any more confuses them. I don't want to confuse these kids any more than they already are.
yeah.
No.
When you say fine and coarse, do you relate that to thickness of the work?
Yes.
Okay.
And softness and.
Right, okay, yes. There are several other things which we can't really determine. I mean, it's hard to determine if this mahogany is softer than poplar, you know, because it's a tree that grows in the forest, and his is steel. It's
Steel and
machined
aluminum.
or made to certain specifications, or aluminum. Yeah. Unless you're resawing, the spring that came with your bandsaw is probably adequate, and the tension scale is probably reasonably close, because you're not trying to prevent this belly that occurs on this board when you don't have quite enough tension to do that. There are 2 types of tires on those wheels. You saw the wheel a minute ago. There is a rubber tire on that wheel. On most of these 14-inch bandsaws, which are clones of Delta, and by the way, Delta built the first one of these bandsaws back in about 1939 or somewhere in that neck of the woods. It looked exactly like these, only it was painted gray. And they've had it in their repertoire of goodies ever since. And it's been the bandsaw to copy for the 14-inch flavor. I mean, this is a copy of a Delta 14. If you put a Delta right out here beside it, you notice matter of fact, you would think the stuff would interchange, and probably a lot of it will. But the tires are of 2 types. One is just a flat piece of rubber around the outside of that aluminum wheel or steel wheel, and it may be pressed on or glued on or something like that to the wheel itself to retain the tire, and it's flat across it. The 14s have a groove in the aluminum wheel. The tire sits down in the groove so it gets good traction, but the tire also has a crown on it like this. Has anybody experienced feeding your saw, and you'll be feeding at a fairly heavy cut in hardwood, and it'll go thump, thump, like that? Sometimes you don't have your blade tracking to the center of the wheel, and what happens is you push in on it. If your backstop guides are set too far back, it'll push it up on the wheel, and it'll go up on the wheel, and it'll jerk, and it'll come back as you relax the pressure on it. It'll go up again on it, and it'll come back as you come back. So if you're experiencing that, check your tracking carefully and whatnot to make sure, especially if you're working with a 14-inch saw that has a crown tire. When I say a crown tire, I mean a tire that comes up to a little peak in the middle. Again, I'm exaggerating, but it's designed to run that blade right at that peak. And that's what this little tilt adjustment right here will do for us. It will center that blade over that. And by the way, when I start doing this procedure here, I want to open up my guides, back my guides off, so that even by turning the wheel by hand, I don't knock the set off of my teeth as I work through my tension and whatnot. So those are the next 2 items that we're going to be taking a look at. And the scale, you can't see it, but the scale is right in this little window here. There's a little red washer that tells you what the way I knew. And if you want to, when we get finished, come on up this evening, and I'll stand around and point some of this stuff out to you. But the little red washer in there tells you that, and he's got it dead on a half inch in here. So that's probably very acceptable for whatever he was doing with that saw. Has anybody got a bigger saw than this? I know there's one in here, but Van Love is not here, so he's got a 20 or 24 inch Laguna, I think. But I'm not. But has anybody got a saw bigger than a 14? Ed?
Got a 24 inch in school.
Okay.
It's 24 inch,
Okay.
but it's a dual.
Yeah. Is it a 2-speed, Roland?
It's, yeah, 2-speed variable.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
We had 3-speed variables in the Air Force. You could cut through glass.
Yeah.
Frictions.
Yeah. Yeah. Bandsaws can get quite complex and quite complicated. When you're talking the saws that he's talking about, a saw like this probably, I'm guessing now at Woodcraft, is probably $800, $900, something like that. You're talking a saw in the neighborhood of what he's talking about. It's probably got a blade welder on it, and it's up in the $6,000, $8,000, $10,000 range. Is a huge price variation. And what kind did you say you had in the Air Force, Roland? I can't remember.
Duals. We had duals.
The duals, yeah. Is that what you got at the school? Is a dual? Yeah. I think that's what we had when I was in the Air Force too.
I think that was pretty standard fare. You had the filing attachments and all that stuff.
Yes, yeah. There's all kind of attachments, and they've got variable speed transmissions in them, and you start getting into all that. It's not necessary. Like we said, we're not in the rocket science mode. These folks are fixing airplanes in the Air Force, and you have to remember that there's no place to pull over and park and call the wrecker. So they got to get it right the first time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the tension. I'm going to take the tension off. Now this will not change the tracking. The tracking will stay the same because I'm not changing the tilt of the wheel up there. And see, the blade's getting looser as I screw this down. Now, if I was to take this all the way down, I could slip this blade off. I'd have to take these guards off, and I'm not going to go through taking this whole saw apart tonight, but I could slip this off of here. Sometimes I've got to push down or tap this down to get it to slide down. It can be a little bit cranky to get it to slide down. So I would take the tension all the way off of it, and I would get it to where that I could take this blade off, take the table insert out, and take this blade off the wheels and take it out through this out here. This little tapered pin, which most people have probably lost if you've had your saw very long, is designed to keep this groove in the table flat here. You drive it in, it's tapered, you drive it in until you feel that both halves of the table are flat here, and then you leave it alone, or you take a pair of pliers and pull it out when you get ready to change the blade. That's what this little pin is for. But unfortunately, on just about every saw I've ever seen use saw, it's gone. I don't know why, but it's not there. I guess they thought they didn't need it. So we'll go back up here and get Mr. Dave back to 1/2 inch. And tension on here.
So for people who don't have a guide, no professional guide, what do you recommend as a technique for setting it?
For setting the tension, just use the information in the saw. For most sawing, Dave, that's fine. If you're going to do a lot of resawing, if you're having trouble, in other words, you're going to run this board, through this blade standing up like this, and you're going to try to resaw this board, get one of those Cobra springs, Ayatura springs, Carter springs, one of those high tension springs, and put it in there, and use a 1/2 inch blade with about 2 teeth per inch, or as coarse as you can get it, and tension it to 3/4, and it'll be pretty close in most cases.
Is that tough on the tire?
I'm sorry.
Is that tough on the tire, all that pressure?
It probably is, Roland, but there's another answer to that too. These tires here that come with the saws are just regular rubber neoprene tires. they sell a urethane tire. Now, if I'd opened this door up here and I'd have seen a blue or an orange tire on here, I would have known that it had a neoprene tire on there. And that helps a good bit when you are dealing with these high tension springs. There's quite a few amenities that you can add in addition to simply the high tension spring. So if you really want to go all out and really get into the resawing business full bore, look at iTour's catalog and see what he recommends and see what he tells you. He's got soup-up kits which make the blade run faster. He's got pulleys and everything down here which makes the blade run faster. He's got all kinds of little tricks to help you with your resawing. But I'd caution you on that soup-up kit with a small motor, because you're gearing a motor up that probably hasn't got hardly enough power now. Not only burn it out, but you would be amazed when I changed. I've got a Delta 14 with a riser block like this, like I say, that I used to resaw. And when I took a 2 horsepower motor off my grain bins, it just happened to be the right RPM. I had to cut a hole in this panel. Well, mine's got a door in the front. This is a solid shield down here. I had to cut a hole here and let the motor stick out the bottom side because the motor was too big for the cabinet. Man, does that thing resaw like 60 going west. It's got enough horsepower that it just, you know, I mean, I'm not talking about jamming it. It just, I don't know, it's sweet. And I felt like, actually that one only had a 1/2 horse motor on it. So I took the 1/2 horse motor off, I put that 2 horse motor on it, and that 2 horse motor is a 220. So that's one disadvantage to really souping them up. You can get up to, I think, 1.5 horses on 110 without too much problem. Still be in 15 or 20 amp breaker. Mo, you had your hand up and I kind of ignored you for a minute, but not really.
How about, I've got a little problem with a little buildup on the tire. Do the brushes help with that? I know they have some brushes.
Yep, they do. Let's see if we got a brush. That's a good question. Okay, this saw does not have a brush on it. I think it's got a place for a brush. I'm not that familiar with the jet, but right here is where the brush goes. The brush is like a stiff paintbrush. It's got an attachment that attaches on, and I think it goes right here somehow. Dave, do you know on it? Okay, I don't know if they are. Oh, iTour's got one. I mean, there's no question about it. iTour's catalog, folks, is like a book.
Just for Bandsaw.
Who does anybody have it?
What is it again? The name?
iToura, I-T-T-U-R-A, I believe is the way you spell it. And he's in Jacksonville, Florida. And see if you can call him up, Vern, on your little internet deal.
I just want to write it down.
Oh, okay. I thought that's what you were doing, trying to find him. You may not be able to slip in on Dave's Wi-Fi out here somehow or another. Dave probably can. But Louis iToura takes these bandsaws apart backwards and forwards, and it's a fun read, if nothing else, to get his catalog and read it if you're interested in bandsaws. But yes, Mo, to answer your question, the brush does help. It doesn't fix it. Okay, it does not fix it. Now, if you have somewhat of a buildup, take the blade off, take a little 220 sandpaper, turn the motor on, and hold a little sandpaper up against the wheel here. And up here, if you can figure out how to get a drill motor or something to turn this wheel up here, hold a little sandpaper against this one. Now these wheels are got a buildup on them. Look at what I'm doing here. With the buildup. See the dust coming down here across the face of the saw? And that'll stop most of that buildup that you're getting on the tire itself. Now that buildup will translate into a harmonic vibration in your saw. So if you're having some trouble with buildup on your saw, clean your wheel real good, get the brush down there and keep that tire real clean. Yeah.
Another question for you, Dave.
Okay.
You'll notice that I don't do this, but a lot of people recommend that when you're not using the saw, you take attention on it.
Okay. I think there's some validity to that, Dave, because it's just like anything else. I think, I can't remember what it was, but was it the old bias-ply tires, if you let them sit overnight on a cold night and you start out down a smooth road, they go thump, 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 thump until they,
Nylon tires.
was it the nylons? Okay, I couldn't remember exactly which ones it was, but they had a flat spot on them. So I'm relatively convinced, and I will tell you, I don't always either, okay? So I'm guilty of doing what, don't do as I do as I say kind of thing here. But yes, I would try to relieve the tension, especially if you're using a high tension situation. If you're using a spring that has more tension on it than is the normal for the saw. Of course, the manufacturers have a catch-22 situation going on here. They want to try to avoid distortion and breakage and all that sort of thing. And oh, by the way, never take that spring to coil bind to put tension on there. Now, what I mean by coil bind is when you take a spring and you look at it up in the air like this, you should be able to see between the coils. In other words, there's some clearance between the coils. Now, you can collapse that thing if you put enough pressure on it to where it's like a solid cylinder. You have just implanted inherent problems in your machine by doing this, okay? Now you have a column that has no shock absorbing ability here at all. So the buildup on the wheels and all that vibration and everything, there's no cushioning effect here. So you may be running into problems from that. So if you think more is better, stop when you can still see just a little bit of clearance in between the spring coils. Okay? So,
When you call that coil bind?
coil bind, yes. In other words, it's essentially taking the spring and collapsing it until it's just like a steel cylinder instead of a spring. If you could put more pressure on it, it would not move. It's stopped. It's gone as far as it can move. So if you put more pressure on it, it's just hammering away at something like a solid piece of steel would. Whereas if the spring has some clearance, it can take that shock up as it goes along and kind of bounce along, sort of like the car spring. Well, I mean, y'all have pulled a trailer. What happens when you get a trailer where the axle's welded to the frame? That thing just dances all over back there, doesn't it? Whereas if you have a trailer with springs on it, it'll generally be at least a little more peaceful as it goes down the road. And that's essentially what's going on here to a certain extent. But yes, those little brushes that are mounted down in here are a good investment. And I hate to keep coming back to Iatura, but again, Iatura sells them. He sells them at a fair price. You know, I mean, it's just the way it is. And so, the other thing that will happen as you get into replacing a blade, you will need to start turning this. Now, I should have backed all these guide blocks off, and I'm not going to do that. Dave has got this tracking quite well in the center. Another little inherent gremlin sometimes is this guide will get up way up there and it'll get against the wheel and whatnot. So let's put a little bit more tension on it here. Get up to where you need to be, tension-wise. Okay, I think we're about there. All right. And if we start monkeying with this little knob back here, pretty soon this blade, it's going towards the back now. You can't see that, but I'm turning the wheel tilt knob back here. It's going toward the back of the blade. Now, the other thing, in order to get this to do this, I have to be moving the blade. It does me no good to turn this knob if I'm not moving the blade. Well, if I turn it enough and turn the saw, the blade jumps off because I've tilted the wheel and I don't know where the blade is. So in order to find out where the blade is, I tilt the wheel and spin it around here. Now it's coming back forward again. And I don't know how well you can see it up there, but if you'll notice, the blade is all the way out, almost ready to come off the front of the wheel right now. You can see the teeth sticking out over top of the edge of the wheel. So that's what our tilt adjustment does for us. And I think primarily the most important things is to learn what these adjustments are, how to make these adjustments, And once you do, your saw will be fairly well tuned up and it'll be ready to go. Ed?
One thing you might mention is the contrary to what you would think. The blade runs to the high side on the tilt.
Yes, okay.
Not the low side, the high side.
Right, and that's another thing. Remember when I asked you if you'd ever experienced any thunking when you were cutting? That's another thing that causes that is as I said before, your wheel isn't, your blade isn't tracking quite right on your wheel, so it's trying to climb up your wheel to the high side, just like Ed suggests. So, you know, that's something that you probably want to give a little consideration. I guess that's pretty much as far as a saw like this is concerned.
Do you have any suggestions for new beginners to touching a bandsaw? Some things you've learned yourself that you wish you hadn't done and you wish you could pass on to the next generation?
Yeah, a lot of what I just told you is somewhat of the voice of experience speaking. In other words, resawing and all that kind of stuff. I've been there, I've tried to guide boards through it, I've found I had blade drift, I've used blades with too many teeth for the thickness of the wood I was using. Generally that's the error that most people make. They use too many teeth, not too few teeth.
What do you think of rounding the back of the blade
Ah,
slightly?
that was something that thank you, Vern. That was something that
I think you can do tighter circles.
Okay, he's exactly right. And I meant to mention that. With the machine running, but before you start this little trick, blow off all that fine powder, that flour powder, that you see on the end of my fingers down there with your air hose. Because you're going to create some sparks with this next trick. What he's talking about doing is, and you wouldn't do it with the blade raised up as high as it is, but he's talking about making the blade turn easier when you're cutting contours. And what you do, when this blade is made, this piece of steel is square at the back. If we could look at it under magnifying glass, we could hold a stare to it, and it would come up, and it would go across, and it would go down. And what he's talking about doing is taking an oil stone and lowering the guide blocks down about here, taking that oil stone and putting it on the back of the blade with the blade running, and going around the back of the blade like this, and rounding the back edge of the blade. And it's effective when you're cutting scroll work to help you turn a tighter radius,
Marks.
and it also makes it easier to turn. Vern's right. I mean, I thought about that somewhere along the line, and it just slipped my mind. I'm glad you brought that up.
You know, another thing, now you're winding up. I use these Timberline blades,
Timberwolf blades.
Yeah.
And the way they recommend torquing them, or tension, is to set them loose, and you turn your bandsaw on and leave your blade guides, high, and they'll wobble or
Flutter.
yeah. And then you tighten it until the flutter goes away, and they say maybe give it another half turn. And I use that, and it works very well with that blade.
It
And-
doesn't make any sense, but it works.
It works.
Well,
they're not that
and
tight.
that's my feeling on it too, Ed, is that they say that it's because the blade is made out of silicon steel. I'm not enough of a metallurgist, but Iatura will tell you there's nothing to all that silicone steel business.
It could be.
But it's good merchandising, and it works for them, and if it works for you, have at it.
I've set other blades that way that aren't, like what is that one they sell, that cheap one down there, Orion or something? And it seems to work with that blade, except I might give it another turn or so.
You've got to put a little more tension on it, maybe.
Yeah, I
than
do,
you-
usually another full turn. And
Okay.
I got the same saw as that.
I think it's in the geometry of the tooth,
Yeah,
not the material, but it does work on the Timberwolf blade.
and the other
The
thing,
Timberwolf is a good blade, but it's an
It is.
extremely expensive blade for what you get. You can buy, like, if you buy a 1/4 inch, say 4-tooth from Timberwolf, you probably pay, I don't know, $15, $18, something like that, in that range. Does that sound reasonable? I haven't bought any in a long
it's
time.
about right.
If you go to Ferris, or you go to Charlotte Knife and Saw, those blades will be $8, $9. Half of that price. Olson will be maybe $5 or $6 cheaper than the same timber wolf, I think. We could get into discussing blade materials. There's carbon steel blades, there's bimetal blades, there's all kinds of different blades. There's carbide blades. I've got a carbide blade for my bandsaw like this, okay? Excellent resaw blade, but just hang on to your wallet, because that was a $100 blade. But the point is, it's the blade that does the cutting. It's not the saw. You can buy every saw in the business and you still can't cut anything until you put a blade on it. That's the same true with the table saw over there. So if you really want to get into cutting wood, find a blade that works for you using the information that we talked about this evening as far as tooth pattern, as far as width, as far as thickness, you know, some of that kind of stuff. Now remember, did I hear somebody's got 18s or 20s or 24s? Is somebody, you said at school you've got a 24 or something. Has anybody got a home saw that's bigger than a 14? Okay.
Ours is what?
14, but it's got a deep throat.
It's got a riser block like this.
No,
No.
it's
Comes-
just comes with a deep throat.
Oh, okay.
Right kind comes that way.
Okay, yeah. Yeah.
14 inches.
What's that?
14 inch, I think.
So you got, oh, okay. What kind is it?
Raycon.
Raycon. Oh, okay. Okay, yeah. Okay. And that Raycon has a bigger motor too, doesn't it? It has 1.5 horses or something on it.
I think so.
I think that Raycon is a fairly decent saw.
Well, they list it for about 1,000, but you can get it around 700.
Is it a 14?
Yes. But if you keep your eyes, I don't know now. Maybe the cheapest is $7.99 on the site.
Oh, okay. I don't know. Because
Pretty much priced the same everywhere.
yeah, I think Raycon had a 20 or something that was just
They got big ones.
wee bit. Well, they got one bigger than that. I don't think Woodcraft
Got
can
an 18 with a 2-horse motor.
That's the one that I was thinking about that might be a little bit souped up from maybe the
Yes.
maybe the 14. And that's going in the right direction in my estimation. The only thing you got to watch on them sometimes is those Chinese motors are not truly the horsepower that they say they are. But obviously, if they're saying a 2-horse motor on this one and a horse motor on this one's somewhat more powerful than that one over there. So at least it's a comparison.
Did you ever use one of those blade guides on the top that it's a ball bearing just for the back and it has a groove cut in it, a single groove? Carter advertises that when he's at the wood shops.
Oh,
when he can cut
okay.
real tight.
He's talking about
They work. I made one.
that is
They work
only
good.
used for very
Yeah.
narrow blades.
Right, quarter-inch.
Quarter inch and less, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong.
You can cut
But
puzzles out of it.
I forget, they call it a stabilizer or something like that.
And the
don't they?
bottom guide, you open it up.
Yeah, basically you take all your other guides out of play and you substitute your top guide for a ball bearing that sits right on the back of the blade with a groove in the outer race, all the way around the outer race so that the blade runs in the groove. It is a neat little trick, and yes, it works, and it's probably worth the money. It's 80, 85 bucks or something.
Yeah, I
Carter.
made it for the price of the bearing about
Well,
$2.
and if you can do that, fine, you know, but
But I pressed the collar over the bearing for the groove.
sure. I mean, if you're ingenious and you've got some metal tools like some of us have, some of us aren't blessed with metal tools, you know, but if you have metal tools, you can do these kinds of things. But I wouldn't deny Carter their due, but the beauty of that is not for so much what you guys do as turners. Keep that in mind. Do not go off on a tangent as you guys and ladies do as far as turning is concerned. That's more for, you can cut out puzzles, jigsaw puzzles with that thing.
I kind of made it because I saw Carter have one. That's
And
the
you can
only
make
reason
it
I
cheap.
made it.
Yeah, exactly. So if you want to, fine, go for it. But it works good and it's good. It's a good technique. It's
I have
good
it.
stuff.
Mostly I just use to make turning squares.
I have one other comment.
Yeah.
I lived in Germany for a long time, on and off with the company I worked for.
Okay.
And a lot of the guys I worked with were like us, you know, and a lot of them had shops. And you know, most of their bandsaws over there do not have bottom blade guides, just top.
Really?
Right.
For scroll work in light material, I think you can get by with that. But for scroll work in heavy material, if you're cutting out cabriole legs out of 3-inch thick stock,
You need them.
I like to have a bottom blade guide. I mean, I like for that blade to be fairly well supported on both sides of my cut. And So remember, that would be twice the thickness of this board that I just picked off of his scrap bin back here, 3 inches, this is 1.5 inches. So that's what I use my bandsaw a lot for. I use a 1/4 inch blade to do it, and I use a blade with about 4 teeth per inch. That's about the finest, I mean about the coarsest 1/4 inch blade you can get, somewhere around 4. A lot of them are 6, but if you're careful, it'll do. But when you start cutting out, you know what I'm talking about, a Queen Anne leg. When you start cutting it out, before you put it on the lathe, yes, it goes on the lathe eventually for some of the operation, but some of the operation is hand done as well after you cut it out. That's a trick, you know, we probably ought to just do that for Grin someday, is get a cabriole leg blank and start cutting it out, because you glue segments back on with hot melt glue so that you have a surface to flip it. Because remember, this is not a single cut down a single board here. This is a cut, which is, I don't know what the description of it is, but it's a cut that it is got depth to it as well as left and right.
Makes you wonder how they did it 500 years ago.
They did it the same way. They took what's called a frame saw. Most European cabinet makers carried a frame saw because they could carry the blades in their backpack, and then when they got to the next job, they would get out their blades and they would make a new frame to fit their blades, and they would work in this shop for 2 or 3 or 4 years, and then the journeyman, he would move on down the road a piece, and he would stick his blades back in and leave his frame behind, so he didn't have to tote that frame.
I make these platters for my son and daughter-in-law. They're racing support to go to Ecuador as missionaries. And this wood happens to come from where they spent the last year in missionary training close to Robbinsville, North Carolina. It's cherry wood. It's been seasoned for multiple years. So it's nice. They have their scripture verse in my bag. And, I have fun doing it. I made probably a dozen and a half already. I've got another half dozen to make for them. So,
That's all kids there.
I got about 20 board feet the last time I was up there, and that's one of the blanks.
Okay. Okay, good job.
Very nice.
I also wanted to thank Roland for making all the tops. Those tops are going into Samaritan's Purse Christmas boxes.
Okay. Oh, how about a birdhouse? You made the birdhouse.
Yeah, you're up.
I am.
Tell us about the birdhouse. What else did you make here? These others?
This little over here. I don't even know what this is. What is salted maple? Okay.
Nice.
And I don't know what to say about it. It was
Looks
fun.
nice.
She's just doing things that may challenge her a little bit in different tools.
Sure.
Just
That looks nice.
She's trying to outdo you.
She's doing it already.
And you
How long
did all right.
How long have you been turning?
So, you better believe it.
How long have you been trying?
Wow.
Come on.
Hey.
And then we got to play with a new buffer, so that's what, this is some press work.
I had a cousin,
Okay.
Beautiful.
And
That's mine. I made a box. I just had a piece of scrap wood around, so I made a box.
yeah,
Pull really hard.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I don't want to break it.
And
And how about these?
No, I didn't make that.
That's mine.
Okay.
Who's that?
Now, you guys got introduced. Did we introduce you at the beginning?
Oh.
Pam and I, yes.
Okay. I wanted to make sure about that, but I didn't remember. Okay.
No, maybe
I don't
Billy's.
know.
Maybe
We
not.
introduced ourselves.
Yeah, that's right.
Usually,
You're
but I
right.
don't
No,
think
we were not introduced.
No, they
Okay,
weren't.
so it's
It's
Pam
done.
and Jack,
Pam and Jack, and you live where?
Fort Mill.
Fort Mill.
Originally from New York.
Oh,
Okay.
That's great. Okay, Ed.
I just got the plan of the candlestick design.
Is that what
Wanted to
they're?
try it and see.
You hollowed it down in the bottom?
Yep.
First thing you
So I
gotta
can
do
put
is
that shot in so they won't tip over.
First thing you gotta do is look at the bottom.
Yeah, sure do. That's right, lead shot in the bottom. I can hear it.
That's nice. That's pretty.
Yeah. Now, what do we got here? Is this Vern, is this yours?
Yeah, that's called a ribbon maker. And it was, I copied a design from a person by the name of Brian McAdee out of Canada. And he just turns a thin bolt and he
Cuts it out.
airbrush. You know, first you draw designs on it with a mask, you remove part of the mask, airbrush, and then you use a dental tool to cut it out and pierce. Turn very green, and I turn it with a light inside attached to the tool. A very high intensity light, like a backup light or a license plate light. That type of light with a transformer, and it's enough you can see very easily. And I learned all that from this Brian, from the video, a DVD.
Is that maple?
Yes, it is. It's a piece of very light maple. I actually went with Jerry when he was buying a hat log, and I bought the whitest one I could find. So I bought a 4-foot log.
Yeah, nice. Very nice.
And the boy was telling me,
775.
Okay, Dale got that. Excellent.
sitting there, and apparently
Now, how about, we do the other $25? Which one is that?
The planer and whatever else I was telling you about, I can't remember, you know, and I said, how much you want? He said $6,000.
Yeah, you're putting
And then I said, I think I can help you sell some of your other
Okay.
equipment. I said,
One more $20.
have some of this other equipment.
On your planer,
Yes,
738.
yes.
do you get insnake?
That generally occurs because you've got your bedroll set too high.
When we got it together,
And so if you lower your bedrolls, you will probably get away from that. Now, if you have your bedroll set up and you're planing off longer, then it's okay, and you run a smooth piece through there and you're getting it, it's okay. But if you really want to prevent that, then lower the bedroll down to where you have a perfectly flat surface.
What else you got here?
Rough lumber very well,
Right.
because rough
Okay.
lumber
It's hung up
We
on
got
the end.
one in here.